There is a strange kind of person in this world. You see them at dinner when everyone else is half in the room and half inside a glowing rectangle. You see them when a sunset turns the sky into something almost sacred, and while everyone around them is busy capturing it, they are simply there, looking, quiet, unimpressed by the need to prove they witnessed it. And when they say, almost casually, "I'm not really on social media," people react as if they just revealed they live in the woods and churn their own butter. But maybe that reaction says more about us than it says about them. Because the person who does not feel the urge to post, scroll, update, perform, document, react, and stay visible at all times is not necessarily antisocial, not necessarily outdated, not necessarily afraid of the modern world. They may just be protecting something the rest of us have been slowly trained to abandon: their attention, their interiority, their ability to exist without an audience. And in a culture where so much of life has been reorganized around being seen, that kind of refusal can look almost suspicious. Because most people no longer ask, "Am I enjoying this?" They ask, "How does this look?" Most people no longer just have an experience. They split in two while living it. One part is in the moment, the other part is already outside of it, observing, framing, editing, imagining the reaction. And that split changes something. It changes the way you remember. It changes the way you relate. It changes the way you feel about your own life when no one is affirming it back to you. So, when someone steps out of that system entirely, it can seem like they are missing a piece of modern life. But what if the opposite is true? What if they are not the ones missing out? What if they are the ones who notice the hidden trade? Convenience in exchange for attention. Visibility in exchange for peace. Connection in exchange for performance. And they simply decided the price was too high. At the surface, social media looks like communication, a tool, a bridge, a harmless place to stay updated, stay entertained, stay connected. But psychologically, it touches something much older than technology. It touches the ancient hunger to belong. Humans are not built to be indifferent to social approval. We are exquisitely sensitive to it. William James once wrote that a human being has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him. In other words, part of who you feel yourself to be is shaped by how you imagine you exist in the minds of others. Social media industrialized that process. It took something fragile and human, the need to be seen, and scaled it into a system. Now, your social reflection is no longer coming from a village, a few friends, a community, or a room. It is quantified, counted, measured, ranked, distributed. And once that happens, something subtle begins to erode. You stop asking whether something matters to you. You start asking whether it will land. Will it get attention? Will it be understood? Will it make people think I'm interesting, attractive, intelligent, relevant, alive? The problem is not that people become shallow. The problem is that they become externally organized. Their inner world starts taking orders from outside. This is why so many people feel strangely empty after hours of scrolling, even when they cannot explain why. So when someone steps out of that system entirely, it can seem like they are missing a piece of modern life. But what if the opposite is true? What if they are not the ones missing out? What if they are the ones who notice the hidden trade? Convenience in exchange for attention. Visibility in exchange for peace. Connection in exchange for performance. And they simply decided the price was too high. At the surface, social media looks like communication, a tool, a bridge, a harmless place to stay updated, stay entertained, stay connected. But psychologically, it touches something much older than technology. It touches the ancient hunger to belong. Humans are not built to be indifferent to social approval. We are exquisitely sensitive to it. William James once wrote that a human being has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him. In other words, part of who you feel yourself to be is shaped by how you imagine you exist in the minds of others. Social media industrialized that process. It took something fragile and human, the need to be seen, and scaled it into a system. Now your social reflection is no longer coming from a village, a few friends, a community, or a room. It is quantified, counted, measured, ranked, distributed. And once that happens, something subtle begins to erode. You stop asking whether something matters to you. You start asking whether it will land. Will it get attention? Will it be understood? Will it make people think I'm interesting, attractive, intelligent, relevant, alive? The problem is not that people become shallow. The problem is that they become externally organized. Their inner world starts taking orders from outside. This is why so many people feel strangely empty after hours of scrolling, even when they cannot explain why. It is not just overstimulation. It is self-alienation. You leave the app, but part of your mind stays trapped in the logic of it. How am I being perceived? Am I behind? Am I less interesting than other people? Is my life too small, too quiet, too ordinary? And the quiet cruelty of the whole thing is that the standard you are comparing yourself to does not even exist. It is performance mistaken for life. A cropped image, a chosen angle, a caption after revision, a mood selected for effect, a self-arranged for consumption. You compare your unedited interior to everyone else's curated exterior and wonder why you lose. Of course you lose. The game was designed that way. This is one of the first things people who leave social media often sense, even if they never say it in psychological language. They feel that something about the environment is distorting their perception, not just of other people, but of themselves. And for some of them, walking away is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of self-preservation, not because they are above validation, not because they do not have an ego, not because they are somehow pure, but because they realize their mind was becoming too porous, too easy to invade, too easy to provoke, too easy to steer. There is a concept in psychology called intrinsic motivation. It refers to doing something because the thing itself is meaningful, satisfying, alive. Not because it earns applause, not because it brings status, not because it gets rewarded. And one of the deepest differences in people who can genuinely live with little or no social media is not that they feel nothing when admired. It is that admiration is no longer the center of gravity. The experience itself is enough. A walk can remain a walk. A meal can remain a meal. A thought can remain private. A beautiful moment does not immediately become raw material. That sounds simple, but it is not. For many people today, the mind has been trained into a nearly permanent state of self-observation. They are not only living, they are monitoring themselves living. Not only feeling, monitoring how they are coming across while feeling. This is exhausting. It creates a strange condition where even pleasure becomes work. Even rest becomes an image. Even authenticity becomes a style. And when that happens long enough, you can begin to lose access to something basic. The ability to be alone with your own life and still experience it as real. That may be one reason people who step away from social media often seem different. Not superior, different. They appear less frantic, less compelled to signal, less magnetized by the need to update their social existence every few hours, because they are getting nourishment from somewhere else. From concentration, from embodiment, from fewer but deeper relationships, from making meaning privately before making anything public. Maslow once distinguished between deficiency needs and being needs. Much of digital life is built on deficiency. More approval, more response, more proof, more reassurance, more stimulation, more evidence that you matter. But human beings become psychologically stronger when they are not constantly feeding from deficiency, when meaning is not outsourced, when self-worth is not crowdsourced, when existence is not submitted for review. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Because if someone does not feel compelled to post, to announce, to curate, to stay visible, what does that reveal about the rest of us who do? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Maybe it reveals how normal it has become to confuse attention with connection. Social media promises connection, but very often what it actually amplifies is exposure. You are visible to more people, yes. But visibility is not intimacy. Recognition is not understanding. Engagement is not care. A person can receive hundreds of reactions and still feel profoundly unseen. In fact, sometimes the performance of visibility makes real loneliness worse. Because when your life is constantly witnessed in fragments, you can begin to mistake being observed for being known. But being known requires slowness, texture, inconvenience, unedited time. It exists in pauses, in silence, in the way someone hears a tremor in your voice that no caption could contain. in the moments too ordinary for an algorithm and too alive for performance. That is why many people who do not live online often have fewer relationships but heavier ones, more rooted ones. Relationships not maintained by passive viewing but by actual investment, less ambient contact, more presence. And presence now is almost radical because one of the most expensive things social media costs is not just time, it is attentional continuity. Your mind learns to live in fragments. A thought begins, a notification interrupts it, a feeling rises, a screen absorbs it, a conversation unfolds. Part of you is elsewhere. Over time, this can train the nervous system into a state of continuous partial attention, never fully gone, never fully here. Daniel Kahneman's work on attention and cognitive strain helps illuminate this in a broader sense. The mind has limited resources, and whatever repeatedly captures them begins to shape perception, judgment, and depth. What does that mean in ordinary life? It means many people no longer just struggle to focus on a book. They struggle to remain inside their own thoughts long enough to discover what they actually think. And that is no small loss. Because attention is not just a productivity tool, it is the substance out of which a self is built. What you attend to repeatedly becomes your psychological environment. And your psychological environment slowly becomes your identity. So when someone opts out of a system designed to fracture attention into monetizable pieces, they are not just refusing an app. They may be refusing a way of becoming more reactive, more externally shaped, more dependent on interruption, more vulnerable to comparison, more conditioned to seek stimulation at the cost of depth. But this is where we need honesty. Not everyone who avoids social media is free. Some people withdraw because they are protecting their attention. Others withdraw because they are protecting themselves from being seen. And those are not the same thing. A person can reject platforms from a place of sovereignty, but they can also reject them from shame. They may tell themselves they do not care, but privately they are afraid of judgment, afraid of exposure, afraid that if they step into visibility, they will be measured and found lacking. This matters because solitude can be healthy, but avoidance can wear the costume of wisdom. Jung warned that what remains unconscious directs our lives from below. If a person leaves social media because they truly see through its illusions, that can be clarity. But if they leave because visibility activates buried inadequacy, rejection wounds, or social fear, then the platform is not the real issue. The wound is. So the question is not simply, are you on social media or not? The deeper question is, what happens inside you when you imagine being seen? Do you feel uninterested or threatened? Do you feel free or defended? Because one form of withdrawal is peace, the other is armor. And if you do not tell those apart, you can romanticize your own fear. Still, for people who genuinely choose absence from a conscious place, something important has usually happened. They have seen that social media does not merely allow performance. It quietly turns performance into the default mode of being. You stop living, then posting. You start living in ways that are already shaped by the possibility of posting. That is the shift. A meal is not just tasted, it is framed. A trip is not just taken, it is packaged. A thought is not just explored, it is pre-edited for reaction. Even identity becomes something to manage like a small private brand. And this is spiritually expensive. Because the more your life is organized around legibility to others, the harder it becomes to inhabit parts of yourself that are unfinished, contradictory, private, uncertain, unresolved. But real development is not neat. Growth is awkward before it becomes articulate. Insight is often silent before it becomes shareable. Healing usually happens in rooms where nothing looks impressive. Viktor Frankl wrote that human beings are not destroyed by suffering alone, but by suffering without meaning. Social media can intensify this by pulling people towards spectacle instead of meaning. It tempts them to turn their life into evidence rather than experience, to ask again and again, not what is true, but what plays well. And people who step away from that system often recover something many others did not realize they had lost: a private life, not secrecy. Privacy, the kind in which identity can breathe before being interpreted, the kind in which a thought can remain incomplete. the kind in which desire does not immediately become declaration, the kind in which memory is formed from immersion, not documentation. This is another thing the digital age quietly damages. Memory. The moment you shift from experiencing something to capturing it for future display, your consciousness changes position. You are no longer fully inside the moment. You are partly outside it, arranging it. Performance mode replaces presence mode, and presence is what deepens memory. This is why some of the most profound moments in life become thinner when filtered through the pressure to share them. Not because cameras are evil, not because technology is inherently corrupt, but because the mind cannot fully surrender to an experience while simultaneously converting it into social material. So yes, the person who does not post their vacation may remember more of it. The person who does not announce every insight may own it more deeply. The person who does not continuously narrate their existence may actually be inside it. And then there is time. People talk about social media as if it only costs minutes. It does not. It costs recoverable fragments of life force. A few minutes in bed, a few while eating, a few while waiting, a few while working, a few before sleep, a few after waking, a few in the middle of boredom, which used to be the doorway to imagination. The total is not just hours, it is a style of consciousness. Because what gets replaced in those moments is not merely nothing, it is reflection, rest, undistracted grief, incubating ideas, the first draft of creativity, the discomfort that would have forced you to ask a better question. B.J. Fogg's work on behavior design helps explain why these systems are so hard to leave. Behavior is not driven by one thing alone, but by the convergence of motivation, ability, and prompts. Social media has mastered all three. The reward is emotional, the access is frictionless, the prompts are constant. So when someone resists it, they are not simply showing preference, they are interrupting a very refined behavioral loop, which is why leaving often feels less like deleting an app and more like waking up from a rhythm your nervous system mistook for normal. At first, there is withdrawal, restlessness, the compulsion to check, the phantom impulse to reach for the phone in the middle of emptiness. And then something else begins to emerge. Silence. At first, that silence can feel boring, then uncomfortable, then revealing. Because in the absence of constant stimulation, you meet what the stimulation was covering. Your loneliness, your envy, your unfinished thoughts, your dependency on response, your fear that without proof your life might feel too small. This is why quitting social media is not automatically liberating. Sometimes it is destabilizing first, because it removes a distraction and returns you to yourself. And that reunion is not always gentle. But on the other side of it, many people discover something unexpected. Their mind stops vibrating all the time. Their standards of enough begin to shift. They laugh more fully in conversation. They read longer. They notice more. They create from a truer place. They stop trying to turn every meaningful thing into something legible. They become less publicly assembled, more inwardly coherent. Joseph Campbell wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. But that privilege becomes harder to access when you are constantly adjusting yourself in response to an imagined audience. Because then you are no longer just becoming a person, you are becoming a version. And versions are exhausting to maintain. This is one reason creators, artists, writers, and thinkers often describe improved work after stepping back from social media. It is not always because they suddenly become more disciplined. Sometimes it is because their attention is no longer split between expression and reception. The work gets less strategic, less eager, less contaminated by invisible spectators. It becomes more honest. And honesty has a different texture than content. Content asks, will this perform? Honesty asks, is this true? Those two questions do not always lead to the same place. Of course, none of this means social media is inherently evil. That would be simplistic. Tools are not demons. Many people use platforms well. They maintain relationships, build businesses, find community, encounter ideas, discover beauty. But the tool is not neutral when it is built to capture and keep attention by provoking insecurity, outrage, comparison, and appetite. So the real question is not whether social media is good or bad. It is whether your relationship to it is conscious. Are you using it with intention? Or does it use your vulnerabilities more efficiently than you understand? Does it serve your values, or does it quietly reorganize them? Does it support your life? Or does it teach you to watch your life from the outside? Because once you understand that, the people who choose not to participate start to make more sense. They are not necessarily rejecting society. They may be rejecting a counterfeit version of connection, a counterfeit version of relevance, a counterfeit version of selfhood. And maybe that is why they can seem calm in a way that is hard to imitate. They do not need every thought witnessed. They do not need every joy validated. They do not need every experience converted into proof that they exist. They let some things remain unannounced, and that is not emptiness, that is wholeness. To live without an audience is not the same as disappearing. Sometimes it is the first time you fully arrive. So if you are someone who has stepped back from social media or never felt truly at home there, maybe you are not broken. Maybe you are not antisocial. Maybe you are not missing some basic instinct everyone else received. Maybe you are simply less willing to trade your mind for stimulation, less willing to confuse exposure with closeness, less willing to outsource your sense of enough. Or maybe you're still figuring out whether your distance comes from wisdom or fear. That matters too. But either way, there is a question underneath all of this that is much bigger than apps, platforms, trends, or culture. Can you still feel that your life is real when no one is watching? Can a moment be complete without being witnessed? Can a thought matter without being posted? Can your identity survive without constant reflection from strangers? Can you live a life that is experienced first and interpreted second? Because if the answer is yes, then something in you is still intact. And if the answer is not yet, that does not mean you failed. It may only mean you have lived too long inside systems that taught you to look at yourself through borrowed eyes. But that can change. Not all at once. Not through purity. Not through shame. Not by pretending technology does not exist. It changes when you start reclaiming tiny pieces of unobserved life. A walk no one hears about. A thought you do not publish. A dinner you do not photograph. An afternoon in which your mind is not being harvested. A conversation where your attention does not leave the room. Little by little, your nervous system remembers something older than performance. Presence. And presence is not flashy. It does not trend. It cannot be quantified. It rarely looks impressive from the outside. But inside a human life, it changes everything. Because your attention is not just a resource, it is your life in visible form. And every time you choose where it goes, you are choosing who gets to shape you. The people who step away from social media are not always wiser than everyone else. But some of them have learned a difficult truth. If you are always performing your existence, you eventually forget how to inhabit it. And maybe that is why the quiet person watching the sunset with their actual eyes can seem so unusual now. Not because they are disconnected, but because they are there